I have about 15 minutes for this presentation, so I'm going to go over a few points, not in great detail, but I want to start out by saying that very often when we hear about the Caribbean conjures up images of vacation, of leisure, holiday, fun, right? But for us from the region, it is far beyond that. So having worked in corporate here in America and having friends not from the Caribbean, I very often get questions which tell me that they don't know that much beyond the sun, the sea, and the sand, right? Just to give you an example, I remember an American friend of mine years ago, he said to me, "Why do you speak English this well?" And I said, "Well, because English is our official language in Jamaica." And I started to explain about having been a colony of Great Britain, you know, and the slaves coming, and we have a Creole language. And his comment was, "So you all got slaves in Jamaica too?" You know? So that was rather interesting. So this presentation pretty much is not to educate so much, but just to give an overview again, like I said, of why things are the way they are in the Caribbean. And then, you know, perhaps you will see a few things along the way that will help to put things into perspective, all right? All right, so when we talk about the Caribbean, it's not very, very easy to define the region, right? It incorporates pretty much, yes, everybody, every island, every country within the Caribbean Sea. But depending on the particular grouping that we talk about, the geopolitical group, it will include areas in Central America. We have Belize. South America, we have Suriname, we have Guyana, considered part of the Caribbean, right? You have islands that are not even within the Caribbean. So Barbados, way out there touching the Atlantic. Turks and Caicos is out in the Atlantic. And then sometimes even Bermuda, which is way out there, is considered part of the Atlantic, right? And then even further, we have some islands on the Yucatan side, the peninsula of Mexico. We have islands belonging to Colombia. And sometimes also they're considered to be part of the Caribbean, all right? So the Caribbean is a huge, you know, region, a multitude of islands. So what we see on the map here does not actually show everywhere. These are just the major ones. When you look at Bahamas, for example, Bahamas has, what is it, 70 islands, 700? 70 islands, right? So we're pretty diverse, you know, spread out all over. So we have, depending on what grouping we're talking about, we have about 42 million people in the region, and only about 2% of that area is inhabited, right? The largest island that we have is Cuba, and the very smallest, again, depending on the grouping that we're talking about, is Saba, which is about 5 square miles. It's just a little piece of rock jutting up out of the sea, right? So next slide. All right, a bit about the history of the region, which has given rise to exactly what it is. So after I go through the slide, we're gonna see a bit about how all of these points I have on the slide have actually shaped the Caribbean, right? So we start out by talking about before the Columbus era, when the islands, the countries were populated by folk coming up from South America, right? So we have the native Indians from the region, the Caribs, the Arawaks, the Siboney groups, and they moved up, you know, into the Caribbean. And then Mr. Columbus, on his way to discovering the East, I think, he stumbled across us in the Caribbean, all right? So they were the first to have arrived in the region around about 1492. And then, I'm sorry. Yeah, and then after that, they were followed by the Portuguese. Then we had the English coming across, the Dutch and French. So everybody started jockeying for position, right? For various reasons to take possession of the different islands within the Caribbean. Yeah? So once the Europeans came, of course, we know that slavery started. And we had Africans being brought across from West Africa mostly into the region. And we know that the whole period of slavery lasted for about 300 years. And the primary reason was to work on the plantations to produce sugar for export back to the so-called mother countries, right? Now, slavery was officially abolished in 1834. And then because there were no more slaves to work on the plantations, they had need for additional laborers. So the region started to get indentured laborers coming in from Asia, right? So we had East Indians coming in, and we had Chinese coming in, for example. And we did have a few Portuguese coming in as well, right? So at the end of our indentureship, we went into another era when people started leaving the plantations to set up their own businesses. So in the Caribbean, we have a lot of Middle Eastern folk who came in during that time. And you will notice in many of the islands, we do have them now as people involved in clothing, fabrics, jewelry, right? So that's something that you'll find, all over the Caribbean. All right, so with all of the jockeying that I spoke about for possession of the different islands, right? Today, out of that, we have a situation where some of the countries, some of the islands that were formerly colonized are now independent sovereign states. And we have a few who still are attached to the previous colonizers. And on this slide, I give an indication of the main countries, the main islands, and what their political situation is. So on the left, we have all of the states which are sovereign states, independent states. So most of them here on the left were former British colonies: Antigua, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, and so on. We do have Cuba that was Spanish, Dominican Republic that was Spanish, all right, and so on, down the line. We also have at the bottom there Suriname, that is formerly Dutch, right? So we do have quite a mix here. And interestingly, most of the countries that became independent did so during the 60s, right? Like Jamaica was in 62, Trinidad the same year. Interesting thing is, Haiti led the way for us in the Caribbean because they were the first nation to become independent. And that happened before the abolition of slavery. So it tells us that Haitians were kicking butt, the Europeans' butt from a long time ago, right? So apart from, say, having been colonies and then gaining independence, we do have the US Virgin Islands, for example, that came into being under the US as part of a treaty, right? They were actually bought from the Danish a couple of years ago in 1917. Yeah? And as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of groupings in the Caribbean. So all of these countries that you see belong to, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, for example, is a grouping of countries that work together economically. You have the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which, as the name suggests, are on the eastern side. They have a single economy, they use similar currency and so on, right? And then we have those countries which are still attached to their former colonizers. So we have the Netherlands, we have France, and we have the United Kingdom that still have territories that they manage in some form or the other in the region. All right, so coming out of all of this now, all of the Europeans coming in, all of the immigration and so on, we have, a few things in the Caribbean which are not the same across the region, right? So many people from the outside will think of the Caribbean as being unique. No, we are not unique, right? Even though, yes, there is cohesion, we have quite a few things that are different. And I'll go through this, quickly. So in terms of the ethnic and cultural makeup, we have people having this, been descended from, all of these immigrants coming in, whether enslaved Africans or the indentured laborers, right? We have Africans mostly from West Africa. The Amerindians, which are still there, we have descendants of them directly in islands like Dominica, right? We have people from the Middle East that we just spoke about who are working in the jewelry trade and so on in the different islands. And we have folk from Asia, like from India, for example. And some of these folks settled more in other islands than in others. So for example, when we look at Guyana, when we look at Trinidad and Tobago, we find that roughly half of the population is made up of descendants of India, Hindus, right? When you look at Suriname, for example, we have Javanese in Suriname, and Javanese are what we now call Indonesians, I think, right? In terms of language, right? We have 6 official languages in the region. And again, these languages have to do with the country in Europe to which we were attached, right, under colonialism. So we have English, we have Dutch in Suriname, in Curacao, Bonaire, Saba, Aruba, French in Haiti, we have French in Martinique, Guadeloupe, we have Papiamento in Curacao, Aruba, and Bonaire, Spanish, obviously, in Cuba, Dominican Republic, and then we do have Haitian Creole as an official language in Haiti, right? The groupings I talked about earlier, so I won't go back into that too much in details. And then in terms of economy, right? So most of us are coming out of a plantation economy based on sugar, like I said earlier, during colonialism. But some of the countries have managed to diversify quite a bit. So if we look at countries like Trinidad, they are among the most industrialized in the region. Trinidad has oil now, and Guyana is now coming up as well with oil, tons of oil. So I have to move to Guyana, Mark. We have agriculture, which is huge in countries like Jamaica and Haiti. Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, offshore banking is key to their economy. Remittances over the past couple of years have started to play a big role in the GDP of the region. So when you look at poorer countries like Haiti and Jamaica, in Haiti, remittances make up about 25 to 30% of their GDP, right? In Jamaica, it makes up about 15%, $2.3 billion every year that we as folk in the diaspora send back home. Tourism, I started out, is all over the Caribbean. Right? And then we have a mixture of all of these things in different countries. We have countries that make a lot of money. For example, Cayman Islands, I think they have the highest GDP in the region. I think it's somewhere in the region of about, I don't know, $80,000 to $90,000, right? When you look at Turks and Caicos, for example, I think it's about 36,000. And then you go all the way down to Haiti. And Haiti, I think, is about $1,500. All right. So we do have quite a bit of diversity in the region when it comes down to that. All right. So again, because of time, this is my last slide. So I will give some unique facts about the Caribbean, right? And there are, there's a ton of stuff I could talk about, with respect to the Caribbean, what the Caribbean has contributed to the world. We know we have a lot of Jamaicans, we have a lot of Trinidadians who are writers, well known. We have politicians here in the United States. We have athletes, we have pretty much a lot going for us in the region in terms of our contribution to the world. What makes it unique is that we're so very, very small, but we have a very, very huge impact on the rest of the world, all right? So just a few key things. So St. Kitts and Nevis, right? They are the smallest sovereign state in the Western Hemisphere, both in terms of population and in terms of physical size. The shortest commercial runway is on that tiny 5 square miles of rock jutting up out of the sea. So there's a picture there in the middle, which shows the runway. I have been there a couple of times, and I tell you, if you don't have nerves of steel, you're gonna have problems flying onto Saba, right? So it's about 1,300 feet long. And also we have the world's smallest shared land space. We have an island that is shared between France and the Netherlands, right? It's called Saint Martin, Saint Martin on the French side and Saint Martin on the south side. That's the Dutch side. And then when we look at Trinidad and Tobago, they have the largest natural deposit of asphalt in the world, right? Said to cover about 100 acres and it's about 250 feet deep, quite extensive. And then this last bullet point, which I have, and I mean, I've seen different things, different countries being mentioned as having this feature. But when we check the Guinness Book of World Records, it says that Jamaica has the greatest number of churches per square mile in the world. And then I wonder why we have so many problems in Jamaica despite that. Right? So again, guys, this was just a quick overview. There are so many things that I could have talked a bit more in depth, but I think this is important, especially since we are going to be talking later on, I hope, about doing projects in the Caribbean, right? So this is a nice enough background, I think. All right, so I will pause now for questions if I have not overshot my time.